Hey, I'm your host, Melissa, and I want to welcome you to Not Your Average Blonde podcast. I'm here to show you how to elevate your life to become the best version of yourself. I want to take you along your journey to be anything but average and step into your confidence era. Join me each week by subscribing and listening to Not Your Average Blonde podcast, and let's begin our journey to become anything but average. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Not Your Average Blonde. If you can tell by the title today, we're going to be talking about divorce. Now, divorce, man, I have so many topics I can talk about on the subject. I'm glad that the narrative is changing on it. More people are talking about their experiences of divorce. More people are going through the process of divorce. And yet there still is a long way to go for this narrative. So I want to talk about that today, especially because when people find out that I'm divorced, and I'm still fairly young, but when people find out that I'm divorced, they usually almost always apologize, which I find really interesting. That when you tell someone I'm divorced and they're always oh, I'm so sorry. And I always no, don't be sorry. One of the best decisions I made in my life. I always tell them to not apologize. And then I explain a little bit more, especially because they usually get confused. And I'm oh no, don't apologize. And when I explain how it was one of the best decisions I ever made, it's kind of funny just watching their facial expressions with it. But I want to get away from that culture. I think it may be culture or a cultural stigma or maybe a society thing. I'm not quite sure why there is such a negative stereotype with divorce, especially with how common divorce is, because culturally, we do have a stigma that is associated with it. Even though it is so common, nearly 50% of marriages end in divorce. And I've heard it's even higher for your second or third or however many other marriages that you've had. That statistic goes up. And so this conversation shouldn't surprise anyone these days. Now, for me, I had to navigate my mindset with divorce. Divorce, it was such a difficult decision for me to make. It took me a long time to reach the decision that I wanted a divorce, and it was hard. It was not easy at all. It's no secret now that I used to be Mormon, and in the Mormon or in the LDS culture, I'm going to use the two kind of interchangeably. Divorce, it carried such a stigma within that faith. But I had to reframe my mindset that divorce, it's not a failure. At the time, it was a courageous decision that led me to a better and a more aligned life. But the word divorce, it carries so much weight. It's often tied to a lot of shame, regret, or the idea that you failed or I failed at something. And this is why I'm talking about this today. Because that's something, it was supposed to be something that was supposed to work forever. But I really had to put in a lot of work to reframe my mindset and to look at my divorce differently. Now, if you've gone through a divorce or are currently navigating one or even healing from one, I want you to take a deep breath and hear me when I say you did not fail. You are not failing. The fact you are thinking through this is a testament that this is not a flippant decision. You chose yourself, and there's so much power in that. So sorry for the dog. If you guys can hear, there's a dog barking in the background. But going back to what I was saying, so I got divorced when I was 25. I was married at 21. I got married so young under immense pressure, religious and societal expectations, which is still crazy when I look back because 21 was considered old back then. 21 was considered old, especially in that culture, which is just mind blowing. But that was the culture. It's you, especially for women, as soon as you turn 18, you need to start looking for your husband, get married as soon as possible, start popping out as many babies as you can and build that family. But reflecting back, I had doubts even before my wedding day, but I pushed them aside because the narrative I was given said that marriage was the ultimate goal, that finding the one on sealing the deal was the whole point of this entire life, which is so crazy. Now I know different. But when my marriage crumbled, I was left with a deep fear that I had failed. A fear that I had failed not just myself, but my family, my faith, my community. I had to unlearn so much stuff and I had to do a lot of healing. I had so many questions and doubts of myself. I had a fear that I would not make it on my own. How could I survive? It was a lot. There's so many things that was going through my head as I made that decision to get divorced. And if you guys are interested in that, I can talk about that more in another episode of the things that led up to my thought process, how I navigated divorce. But this episode today is talking about reframing divorce not as a failure, but a bold and necessary choice that can lead to an even better life. I made that choice for myself and I reframed my mindset that no matter what, I am going to have a great life, even though I'm divorced. I have decided I am going to have a great life. So let's get into the contents of today's episode. I wrote down a few notes that I'm going to kind of walk through, and I'm going to have a couple of lists in here. So this should be some pretty good stuff. So recognizing when a marriage is no longer serving you, it is one of the hardest but most necessary realizations that you can have. Like I said, it was a long process for me to get to the point of divorce, and it was hard. It was a tough process to navigate, but recognizing it, I would say, was probably one of the first major crucial steps that I had to take to leading up to my divorce. If you're constantly questioning whether you should stay or go, here are some major red flags that indicate that may be time to walk away. So first off, your gut probably already knows what's up because your intuition's right. And some other signs is going to be that communication is broken down. Every marriage has disagreements. Don't get me wrong. It's just a natural part of being human. You're going to have those disagreements. But when those conversations or disagreements turn into constant fights, silence, or even avoidance, that foundation, it's going to crack. When you're not able to repair that, it's going to create a permanent fracture. And that fracture is going to be so difficult to repair. If you feel unheard, misunderstood, every discussion ends in frustration, this is a massive sign that deeper issues are at play right now. The next is emotional and physical abuse. Abuse is never excusable. If your partner belittles, manipulates, or physically harms you, it's not just a bad relationship, it's a dangerous one. No amount of working on it will justify staying in an environment that diminishes your safety and self-worth. Now, for me, one of my big light bulb moments was that realization that I never want to bring kids into this environment. I don't want to have kids with this man, and I never want to raise kids in this environment. That was a huge light bulb moment for me. And a lot of that is because of these signs that I'm giving you right now. So we have communications broken down, you have emotional and physical abuse. The next is loss of trust. And these aren't in any specific order. This is just some of the top things when I was brainstorming about my divorce, what led me to that point of divorce. But loss of trust, trust is such a crucial aspect of any strong relationship. It really is that bedrock. When you have lying or deceit or betrayal that comes into the narrative, whether it's through infidelity, financial dishonesty, or broken promises, when those become patterns, it's nearly impossible to build a future together. If you're constantly second guessing your partner's words or actions, there's a sign something is deeply wrong. Next is you begin to feel more like roommates than partners. When love shifts into more of an obligation and emotional connection fades, you will find yourselves coexisting rather than truly sharing life together. If intimacy, both emotional and physical, is completely gone and the desire to reconnect isn't mutual, it might be a sign that the relationship has run its course, which sucks. But that can also be hard to recognize that until you're past that point. And a lot of that comes from when you feel more like roommates, it comes from you both have outgrown each other, or you're on diverging paths, or one person is growing and the other person is stagnant. At the end of it, you both have outgrown each other. This is so common among couples because growth is natural. But if you find that you or your partner are no longer aligned in value streams or your vision that you have for the future, that's when resentment and frustration start to build up. If you're constantly suppressing parts of yourself to make it work, it may be time to ask, am I staying because I'm happy or because I'm afraid to leave? Divorce, it's never an easy decision, but staying in a marriage that's eroding your well-being isn't the solution either. It's not healthy. Recognizing these signs doesn't mean you failed. It just means you're becoming aware of what you truly deserve. And I will note, if you are the problem, if you are the one that's struggling with those things, but your partner isn't, don't get divorced. Go and fix you. If you're content with being stagnant while your partner is growing and is actually trying to work on themselves, you don't fucked up. You need to go get help. You go work on yourself and go grow. Like I said, it's a natural part of being human is having growth. Being stagnant is not healthy. Because if you don't go and get help, especially if your marriage does continue to go through the process of divorce, you're going to carry that baggage with you into the next relationship. So I say all that to work on yourself before you make the decision to get a divorce. Turn inwards and reflect and analyze. And it's not going to be pretty because we're all human. We're going to all make mistakes, but at least put in the effort to work on yourself before making that final decision of getting a divorce. And if your partner's not willing to do the same, you can't control them. But at least you know that if and when you do walk away, you tried your best. You gave it your all. And so, as I briefly mentioned in the intro, I want to go back to the cultural stigmas around divorce. There's so many cultural stigmas still with divorce because society conditions us to believe that success in marriage is measured in longevity rather than in quality. The longer you stay, the more successful your marriage is deemed to be, even if it's toxic or it's making you miserable. It's insane. And I feel this notion is even worse, especially if there are kids involved. Is this the type of relationship example that you want to set for your kids? No wonder we have so many dysfunctional relationships these days, because many of us did not have good examples of what a healthy relationship looks like. So many of us had parents. I'm not saying my parents are this way, but just in general, it's very common that so many people had parents who had very unhealthy relationships, and they didn't have that example of what a healthy relationship looks like. And so you're going to have those childhood wounds that you carry with you into adulthood unless you work on getting them fixed, which a lot of us are working on in adulthood to work through those childhood wounds. You're going to carry that into your next relationship. Not saying it's going to be permanent. You put in the work and you fix it and you heal from it and you work through that and you develop and learn what a healthy relationship looks like and how you can be a healthy partner in that relationship. But so many people, they would rather just stay in a toxic situation because of your marriage vows, until death do us apart, or we are together forever. This is guilt that is placed on people for leaving. I feel like women, we are shamed and judged more for divorce, which is ironic because statistically, women, we do initiate divorce more than men. Numerous studies have shown that the initial economic cost of divorce falls more heavily on women as well, too. They experience a sharper decline in household income and have greater poverty risk. If there's kids involved, that's going to complicate things a lot more as well, too. And I do want to have another episode talking about finances after divorce that will apply for both men and women, but especially for women who are experiencing divorce. And I say all that because coming out, being divorced, in the LDS church and going through that culture, I saw it was a common trend for women who are divorced to walk away with literally nothing. They had absolutely nothing. And I'm not saying this to bash on men. That's not my intent. And hopefully you don't take that from this episode. But I saw many times, because marriage was prioritized for women at such a young age, they chose marriage over education and other skills. This is the cultural expectation. This is one of the reasons why I was told by the church from my marriage failing, because I chose education instead of dropping out of college to satisfy my husband's needs. I was literally told that, which is so wild. It's very archaic. But looking back today, I'm 1,000% grateful I was so insistent on finishing my education and that I pursued higher education. But for most women within the LDS church who get divorced, they have no education or skills that can provide a livable income for themselves, and their children. And there's also attached the stigma that divorce was her fault as well. In many cultures, religion, it plays a huge role in keeping people in unhappy marriages. Mormonism, for example, teaches that marriage is eternal. So leaving doesn't just mean ending a marriage. It means breaking a sacred covenant with God. It means breaking apart a family with consequences that are tied to your eternal salvation. That's pretty steep consequences. Now, how is it that for shame and heavily complicating the decision to get divorced? Like I said, it makes it such a tough decision too. So I digress a bit. But the mental gymnastics that happen, when you start questioning whether your happiness matters more than the fear of what others will think, is what it comes down to when you're going through the divorce process or when you're thinking about divorce. So why do we treat divorce as an ending rather than an evolution? This was one question I had to ask myself as I was going through my healing process is what if we saw divorce as a transition? It ultimately is a transition in your life. Yes, it can be rough. It's going to be rough, especially to start the divorce, going through the divorce process, and even that time period, when you're newly divorced. But I'm a testament that divorce is a transition into a new and a better version of ourselves. There's so much potential that's there. How fucking cool is that? You have to reframe divorce from failure to growth, because divorce, it isn't about quitting. It's about choosing your peace over dysfunction. When I look back on my divorce, I don't have animosity over it. I view it as a stepping stone on my path in this life. Some people, they're meant to be in your life for several chapters, and others only for short periods of time, and that's okay. The hardest part is not signing the papers. It's walking away from the vision that you had for your life. I struggled a lot with this while I was in my marriage, when I was thinking about divorce, and even some of the moments after I got divorced. I wrestled so much with the potential of what could have been. And this is one of those traits in general that I have to continuously work on, not just with my marriage, but in my relationships with people in general. It's learning to accept people as they are versus giving them the benefit of the doubt, because I can see and sometimes hold on to the potential that they could be. And like I said, this applies to so many facets of the connections I have in my life. This is when I'm leading people. This is when I'm in relationships. This is with my siblings. This is a topic that I have to temper for myself, because that's not fair to those people. And that's not healthy for me either. But it's a lesson that I have learned. Now, other lessons I learned through my divorce is learning who I am outside of a relationship. I had to learn how to separate my identity from being tied to being someone's spouse. My divorce was a massive catalyst for learning who I am, who Melissa is, and the woman that I wanted to become, and the woman who I still am becoming. I had to learn how to redefine myself completely. And that process can look differently for everyone. And there's different approaches that you can take with it. Like for me, I had so many events that happened around the same time as my divorce. I had a lot of change that was going on, just a lot of upheaval in my life. And when I got divorced, I stepped back from dating and I needed to do a lot of healing. And I thought I was just going to step back for a year. I ended up stepping back 5 years. It was crazy. It was so much longer than I actually intended, but it was exactly what I needed. And the process it was rough, but it was really good. And I fucking love who I am today. I love the woman that I've become, the woman that I have grown into, and the woman that I'm continuing to grow and evolve into. It's really cool. And it goes back to, yet again, getting a divorce was one of the best decisions I could have made for my life. Next was realizing how much of your happiness was sacrificed. I was forced to reflect on the compromises that I was making that were not aligned with what I truly wanted, like when I was married. I also had the realization that, like I said before, that I never wanted to have kids with this man. I was so miserable, and I'm sure he was too, to an extent. And that was not an environment that I wanted to bring or raise children in. It was not the type of environment I wanted to, set that example for, little ones. I don't want to set that marriage example to my, my children or my future children. So I had to make that decision. That was one of the lessons that I learned through my divorce. Along with that, I also had to recognize patterns that I will not repeat. And that's also a decision that I am not going to repeat X pattern. Divorce teaches you so much about your own boundaries, and it shows you what your standards and non-negotiables are for future relationships. And this one is massive, especially for how young I was, but I lived and learned. Getting back to recognizing patterns, with learning and understanding those patterns, I did have to learn how to let go of shame and guilt. Divorce, it can bring so much grief and agony. You're not just mourning the end of a relationship, but you're mourning the loss of an entire life that you thought that you were building. And through that process, guilt creeps in. Guilt can show up in so many ways. Lots of questions of did I try hard enough? Did I make a mistake? What did I do wrong? Am I disappointing my family? Am I letting my kids down? So many questions. Was the community going to think of me? The questions are endless. And I had people that would tell me as well, and this is where you need to cut some of these people out, because if you're thinking about getting divorced or are currently navigating divorce, you're going to have so many people that are going to have different opinions on it. And you're going to have some people that are very negative about it. I had some people when I went through my process that told me, maybe if you prayed harder or served him more, your marriage would have worked. Talk about brutal. But the truth, being in that unhealthy marriage would not have made me stronger. It would have broken me down further. I was already a shell of a person when I finalized my divorce, and I can't even begin to imagine who I would have become if I'd stayed in that unhealthy situation. And those people that are going to fuel that negative narrative or give you that quote unquote advice, cut them out. You don't need that negativity in your life, because that's just going to add to the shame and the guilt. It's just going to keep building it. But making that shift, it helped me to let go of that guilt. And I did have to cut some people out of my life. I also had to make that mental shift. I first had to accept that I'm not perfect. Neither was he. But that's okay. We are both human. But walking away, I knew I did the best I could until I couldn't anymore. I sought therapy. I did couples therapy. I tried to have those crucial conversations and work through things with him. But you can't force other people. Making the mental shift to let go of guilt, I had to understand that I was never supposed to shrink myself to fit inside a relationship that wasn't meant for me. And if he's not willing to do the work, you can't force him. You can't force someone to do that. So if you're going through this right now, I want you to ask yourself, would you rather live in a life that others approve of, or a life that actually fulfills you? You need to rebuild a new narrative. Because divorce, it's not a dead end, merely a redirection towards a life that actually aligns more with who you are. This process, it's an opportunity to redefine what love and partnership and fulfillment means for you. Change the narrative from I failed at marriage to I'm learning how to build a life I truly love. This part is so important. It's so important to rewrite your story, because if you don't, someone else will write it for you. It took me years to become comfortable with talking about my divorce. There was so much shame and guilt that was associated with it. It took me a long time. And so many people created deferring narratives for why my marriage ended, which added more to that shame and guilt. Some are pretty heinous accusations, such as spreading rumors of infidelity. And those hurt a lot. But I did overcome it. And I had to learn how to shed that shame and guilt that other people were trying to impose on me. Because I know the truth. I know what happened and the events that led up to divorce. And just because I wasn't public with it doesn't mean that changes the reality of the situation. Because during that time, I was incredibly private about my life. As I was rebuilding who I was and reframing the narrative of who I am and who I was becoming, I became more at peace. Your life after divorce, it can be better than the life that you thought you were supposed to have. I truly believe this. I'm 1,000 times happier now than I ever was in my marriage. God, I was so fucking miserable. So now how do you do this? Things are super painful right now, especially if you're in the throes of like going through divorce or you're still trying to heal from your divorce. But like, how do you begin to build a better life and step into the evolved version of you? So first, get clear on what you want next. Take the time to rediscover what excites you and inspires you. This may take some time. This may take a lot of time. For me, it took years. But I really had to shed so much of those influences of things in my life that were dictating what box I should fit in. And it was tough, but it was so worth it. It was so worth shedding those narratives and stepping out of the box and growing my confidence and ultimately the woman that I love and who I am today. Next is surround yourself with people who support your growth. Like I said before, cut out those people who shame you for your choices, unless they're positive changes, like if you're struggling with addiction. Those people who are trying to place you in that box or shame you, or negative narratives of how they think you should be, cut them out. Get them out of your life. You don't need that negativity and influence in your life. This is also going to be more crucial, especially as you get older. Your circle grows a lot smaller and you learn how to like shed people from your life and when to keep people in your life. And that circle is going to be very small, but you want to surround yourself with people who are going to give you that positivity and who are going to support you like in your growth and the direction that you are going, which goes into the next point of investing in your healing. Healing is going to be a process. There are a lot of ups and downs, almost like waves. I had a therapist that described it as it's like ocean waves. Like you're going to have those highs and you're going to have those lows. And those waves may come like in very rapid succession, but over time, those waves are going to get further and further apart and smaller. And eventually it's going to smooth out. And I promise you, it's so true. I promise you that it's worth taking that time to seek the therapy, self-reflection, read the books, journal, whatever it is that works for you to heal, go out and go get new experiences. This is your time to rebuild. This is your opportunity to build yourself into the person that you want to become. This is your opportunity to build yourself into the person you want to become. So to recap the mindset shifts from moving forward, divorce, it's not a failure. It's self-preservation. Staying in the wrong situation is what truly would have been a failure. Next, you don't have to explain or justify your decision to anyone. People will always have opinions, but they don't have to live your life. You do. You're the one who has to live your life. You are allowed to be happy again. So many people feel like they need to earn happiness after divorce. That's bullshit. You don't. You are worthy of a beautiful life just as you are. And lastly, love after divorce isn't impossible. It's just different. Whether you choose to be single or find someone new, you now have the wisdom to build something better. And you also have the opportunity to build yourself into a better person, into a better partner. So if you're listening to this and struggling with a divorce, I want you to know you are not alone. You have the power to reclaim your life, your happiness, and your future. Divorce does not define you. It's not a title. It does not define you and who you are as a person. Even if you made mistakes in it, you can change, you can grow. Divorce is simply a chapter in your story, but it's not an ending. And you deserve peace, happiness, and emotional fulfillment. So thank you so much for joining me today on Not Your Average Blonde. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs this reminder. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Not Your Average Blonde on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, whichever your medium is, for more conversations on reinvention and mindset. You can also DM me on Instagram at Melissa Ventures or NYAB Podcast if you've been through a divorce and want to share your story, or if you have questions. I'm more than happy to do more episodes and talking about like my experience and like navigating divorce and then healing after divorce and how to set yourself up for the next chapter. There's going to be more to come in future episodes, but it helps me out if you guys have like specific questions, and I'll happily will answer them. I love connecting with you. Have a great day.